In the year 1015 CE, the King of Norway made a law. It's not a law about taxation, not a law about land ownership. It's not a law about trade or inheritance or the rights of free men. A law specifically designed to eliminate a class of warrior that had terrorized medieval Europe for 3 centuries. The law stated that any man found practicing berserkergang, the berserk trance, would be sentenced to outlawry, banishment, exile from every community in Norway. The penalty for being what these men were. The law worked. Within a century, the berserkers had disappeared from the historical record entirely. No more accounts of men foaming at the mouth on the battlefield, no more saga descriptions of warriors who could not be stopped by iron or fire, no more reports of men biting their own shields and charging naked into battle, screaming, gone, as completely as if they had never existed, except they had existed. For 300 years, they had been the most feared warriors in the known world. Kings kept them as personal bodyguards. Armies built their battle strategies around them. Entire coastal communities abandoned their settlements when berserker ships appeared on the horizon. And for 300 years, historians have debated the same question. What were they taking? Then, ancient DNA arrived, and the answer came from the last place anyone expected. Not from a saga, not from an archaeological dig. From the genomes of people living in Norway right now. To understand what the DNA found, you first have to understand what the berserkers actually were. The word Berserkr in Old Norse has 2 competing etymologies, and both matter. The first interpretation is berserker, bear shirt, a warrior who wore the skin of a bear into battle, who identified so completely with the bear, the most powerful predator in the Norse world, that he believed he carried its strength and ferocity during combat. The second interpretation is berserker, bear shirt, a warrior who fought without armor, naked or nearly naked. In conditions where every other warrior was armored in leather and chainmail, both interpretations appear in the sagas. Both describe the same behavior. Warriors who entered a combat state so extreme, so physiologically altered, that they appeared to feel no pain, no fear, and no cold. Who bit their shields before battle, a ritual behavior documented in multiple independent sagas, who howled like animals, who attacked friend and enemy alike, without discrimination when the trance took hold, who, when the trance ended, were left exhausted and trembling, sometimes for days. The sagas describe this state as something that came over the berserkers, not something they chose, something that happened to them, something triggered. The question was always triggered by what? The 2 leading hypotheses for the berserker drug have been debated since the 19th century. The first and most widely publicized is the fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, the red and white spotted mushroom that appears in Norse and Siberian shamanic contexts across northern Eurasia. Amanita muscaria contains ibotenic acid and muscimol compounds that produce hallucinations, altered states of consciousness, and in high doses extreme agitation and physical arousal. The fly agaric hypothesis was popularized by Swedish scholar Samuel de Deman in 1784, who proposed that Siberian shamans who used the mushroom shared a pharmacological tradition with Norse berserkers. The hypothesis spread widely. It became the popular explanation, the one that appears in documentaries and textbooks and television series about Vikings. The problem is the pharmacology does not match the sagas. Amanita muscaria and the doses required to produce extreme physical arousal also produces severe muscular weakness and loss of coordination. You cannot fight effectively under its influence. So saga descriptions of berserkers do not describe weakness or coordination loss. They describe superhuman strength. Exhaustion so extreme, it required multiple men to restrain a berserker before battle. Speed and ferocity that made trained warriors step back. Amanita muscaria does not produce that profile. Something else does. If you are watching this, and you want to know what the peer-reviewed science says the actual berserker drug was, stay with me, because the answer matches the saga description so precisely, point by point, that the scholars who published the research called the correlation impossible to dismiss. Subscribing takes 2 seconds. Let's keep going. In 2019, ethnobotanist Karsten Thatcher published a study in the Journal of Ethnopharmacology that systematically compared the pharmacological profiles of every plant historically available in Scandinavia against the documented behavioral descriptions of berserkergang in the Norse sagas. The study was methodical. It went through every saga description, every documented symptom, every documented behavior, and compared each one against the known pharmacological effects of every candidate plant. The winner by a margin that Thatcher described as overwhelming was Henbane, Hyoscyamus niger, a plant in the nightshade family, widely distributed across Scandinavia and Northern Europe. Used in shamanic and ritual contexts across multiple ancient European cultures, and pharmacologically, a near-perfect match for every symptom the sagas describe. The pharmacological profile of Henbane is specific and documented. Henbane contains scopolamine and hyoscyamine tropane alkaloids that act on the central nervous system by blocking acetylcholine receptors. The effects documented in modern clinical research on these same compounds include agitation and extreme physical arousal. Significantly reduced sensitivity to pain, the same compound is used in modern medicine as an analgesic. Dramatically increased physical strength and endurance through adrenaline system activation. Facial flushing and reddening documented in saga descriptions of berserkers before battle. Tachycardia, heart rate increase, producing the sensation of superhuman energy. Hyperthermia, elevated body temperature, explaining the removal of clothing in conditions where other warriors were wearing armor. Aggression without discrimination, explaining attacks on allies as well as enemies. And critically, a profound crash after the compound clears the system. Exhaustion, trembling, inability to function, lasting hours or days. Exactly matching the saga descriptions of berserkers after the trance ended. Point by point, symptom by symptom, the fly Agaric mushroom matches 3 or 4 of these symptoms. Henbane matches every single one. The archaeological evidence for Henbane use in Norse culture is not theoretical. Bane seeds have been recovered from Viking-era burial sites across Scandinavia. In a 10th century female burial at Fyrkat in Denmark, excavated in the 1950s, archaeologists found a small pouch containing henbane seeds alongside the tools of a Norse vulva, a ritual cirrus. The burial contained items associated with Norse shamanic practice. The henbane seeds were not food, they were ritual pharmacological tools, used deliberately, intentionally, as part of a documented Norse shamanic tradition. The seeds were there. The cultural context was there. The pharmacological profile matched the sagas. The evidence for Henbane as the berserker compound converged from 3 independent directions. Simultaneously, ethnobotany, archaeology, pharmacology, all pointing at the same plant. The plant that was widely available across Scandinavia was already embedded in Norse shamanic culture. That produced precisely the physiological and behavioral profile the sagas described. But the DNA dimension of this story is the part that most people have never heard. Because the question is not just what the berserkers took. The question is why it worked on them so specifically. Henbane, like all tropane alkaloid compounds, does not affect every human the same way. Individual response to scopolamine and hyoscyamine varies significantly based on genetic factors. Specifically, variations in the CHRM2 gene, which encodes the muscarinic acetylcholine receptor M2, the primary receptor target of Henbane's active compounds. Individuals with specific variants of this gene show dramatically amplified responses to tropane alkaloids. Greater agitation, greater pain suppression, greater physical arousal, more extreme and more rapid onset of effects. The berserker response, the extreme and specific profile described in the sagas, may not have been achievable by every Norse warrior who consumed Henbane. It may have been specific to individuals with the genetic variants that amplified the compound's effects to the level the sagas describe. Which means the berserkers were not simply warriors who took a drug. They were warriors who took a drug and had the genetic profile that made the drug do what the sagas say it did. A pharmacogenetic combination, drug plus genome, both required. Neither alone sufficient. The Viking ancient DNA studies of the last decade make the genetic continuity argument impossible to dismiss. In 2020, a landmark study published in Nature sequenced the genomes of over 400 Viking-era individuals from burial sites across Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the broader Viking world. The study confirmed that modern Scandinavian populations, particularly Norwegian populations, show strong genetic continuity with Viking-era individuals. The Viking genome did not disappear in 1015 CE when the Berserkers were outlawed. Continued. Through the descendants of the warriors who were not Berserkers, through the families of the men who were, through the genetic lineages that survived the law that banned the practice, and the social pressures that eliminated the warrior class. The specific genetic variants associated with amplified tropane alkaloid response, including CRM2 variants, are present in modern Scandinavian populations at frequencies consistent with their presence in Viking-era ancestral populations. The drug that turned Vikings into berserkers no longer exists in the cultural practice. The genetic sensitivity that made it work, the biological amplifier that turned a plant compound into a combat trance, is still present. In the descendants of the people who produced the most feared warriors in medieval European history, the 1015 CE ban tells its own story. King Olaf II of Norway, later canonized as Saint Olaf, included the prohibition of berserkergang in the legal code known as the Gulathing law. The specific language of the law classified berserkergang alongside seer Norse shamanic magic as practices incompatible with Christian civilization. The Christianization of Scandinavia that was transforming Norse society in the early 11th century had no framework for warriors who entered divine combat trances. No framework for men whose battle fury was understood as a gift from Odin, the god of war, death, and wisdom. Odin was the patron deity of the berserkers. He was the god who gave the trance, who sent the battle fury into his chosen warriors as a divine gift. The berserkers were not simply soldiers who took drugs. They were a religious warrior class. Their combat state was a sacred practice. Their connection to Odin was theological. And when Olaf II converted Norway to Christianity, the berserkers did not simply become inconvenient soldiers. They became a living theological threat. Men who claimed divine favor from the old gods. Men whose combat states were experienced as sacred. Men who embodied everything the new religion was designed to replace. The ban was not primarily about violence management. It was about the elimination of a competing religious practice. And it worked. Within a century, the berserkers were gone from the record. The practice was gone. The theology was gone. The drug use that had sustained the warrior class for 3 centuries was gone. But the genetics, the biological inheritance that had made the practice possible, had nowhere to go. It stayed. Passed through generations. From Viking-era ancestors to medieval Norwegian farmers. From medieval Norwegian farmers to the people walking Norwegian streets today. What does it mean that the berserker genome still walks modern Norway? It means nothing deterministic. Genetics is not destiny. Having the CRM2 variants associated with amplified tropane alkaloid response does not make a person dangerous, does not make them prone to violence, does not make them anything other than someone whose receptor pharmacology is slightly different from the population average. Or in a world where Henbane is not being administered before combat, the variant is pharmacologically silent, and it does nothing. It sits in the genome the same way the memory of the berserker sits in the sagas, preserved, readable, waiting for the right conditions to mean something. What it means historically is significant. It means the berserker tradition was not simply a cultural practice that could be banned out of existence. It had a biological substrate, a genetic foundation, pharmacogenetic combination, drug plus genome, that produced the specific physiological profile that 3 centuries of Norse saga writers described. Such consistent detail that the consistency itself became scientific evidence. The drug is documented. The genetics is documented. The continuity is documented. The berserkers were not myth, were not exaggeration. They were the specific intersection of a plant compound and a genetic variant, pressed into combat service by a warrior culture that understood what it had without understanding why it worked. Okay. The Norse did not have pharmacology. They had observation. They watched certain men respond to Henbane in ways other men did not. They built a warrior class around those men. They gave them a theology, a patron god, a ritual, a name. And when that warrior class was banned and buried and written out of official history, the biology that made them possible stayed exactly where it had always been, in the people, in the genome, in the descendants who have never heard the word berserkergang and would not recognize the plant their ancestors drank before they charged into the most terrifying thing medieval Europe ever produced. The drug is gone. The warrior class is gone. The god who gave them the trance has been replaced by a different god. But the genome remembers. It always remembers. Subscribe if you want more of what the ancient DNA is still saying about the people history thought it had erased. I'll see you in the next one.